Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 15th episode of the story in which Naruto accomplished the impossible. You cannot stop the flow of time. Its will only rotates in one direction. A mere human cannot change that path. This story is from Dorsey. Please support him, her. She is also a digital artist, so please visit her profile. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Peace is contradictory by its very nature. People long for it. They speak out to stop the fighting and violence, all in the name of peace. At this very moment, the finest shinobi of the village hidden in the leaves were preparing to march into a battle for it. The greatest irony was that peace was something that must be protected through violence. For the sake of their future, of their children, and altogether for the sake of the whole shinobi world, sometimes you had to be a hypocrite. Konoha envoys had spread all across the elemental nations to call shinobi into battle, asking the Kage for their champions to support the fight against a common enemy whose final goal was to steal all the bijou and shove the word into a never-ending genjutsu. Minato carefully elected not to share more details than were absolutely necessary, but he still provided enough information for the Kage to at least consider his request. Strangely, the shinobi world answered the call. Fighters came from all 5 nations, if not armies then at least the strongest their lands were able to offer. It wasn't because Anoki had let go of his currently dormant hatred, but because Kitsuchi had volunteered. Nor did the Raikage overcome his stubbornness, but B was just more stubborn than him this time. The Kazekage sent a whole squad without even asking anything, hoping to repay the debt he owed to Minato and his brother. All of this was possible because of a single man. Because of the bonds he made, the friendships and alliances he had been building all over the nations during the last 11 months since Uzumaki Naruto had crashed into the era. It wasn't the allied shinobi forces nor even a union, but it was a great step toward it. For the first time since shinobi walked the earth, the great nations would fight together and not against each other for selfish goals like land, power, or resources. This time they would fight for the sake of the future kings, the children from Iwa, Suna, Kumo, Kiri, and even the smaller countries. Weapons tinkled as honing stones skimmed on their surfaces in the otherwise silent room under the Hokage tower. The shinobi sharpened them to a keen edge to effortlessly slice even a falling silk scarf. Countless kunai slipped into pouches silently to take their places next to hundreds of smoke, flash, and who knows what kinds of bombs. At the highest floor of the tower, Naruto, Minato, Jiraiya and Sarutobi prepared for the battle in their own way, by going over every small detail the time traveler could provide about Obito's abilities and strategy over and over again. Naruto rubbed his face and let out a deep growl, but halfway it morphed into a tired sigh as fatigue overcame him. Telling them everything he could remember repeatedly was pushing him beyond his limits. And he'd definitely been at his limits for the past few hours, continuously balancing on the thin line that separated his logical and emotional mind. Recalling a past that he wasn't keen to recall. It felt like a kunai shoved into his heart to even remember some of those events, but talking about the techniques and how they killed his comrades during the war was like a twist with that kunai with every single sentence. He struggled against remembering the details they were so eager to know about. The only thing that restrained him from shouting, "No more," was the belief that this intel would save their lives. Naruto finally reached the end of his tales with his last battle against Obito and shot a pleading glance at his father, who until now had listened to his explanations with a furrowed brow. Minato ran his eyes over his son's tensed form until they settled down on his tired expression. The Kage winced and nodded and Naruto immediately slumped in the armchair like a puppet without its strings, finally relieved over the pressure of remembering. Jiraiya strolled to the other side of the room silently to gaze out of the window, reassuringly squeezing Naruto's shoulder as he passed by. "We should leave B-san here. Bringing another Jinchuriki inside is foolish." Naruto let out a snort. Octopops is a super strong shinobi. He's almost in sync with Gyuki, and he was a great asset on our side during the war. He can take care of himself, even if he's a bit weaker now, he can still be one of our trump cards. Besides, he's already here. If we leave him behind or send him home, it would ruin the trust we've been building between our nations." Letting out a sigh, Minato nodded, and this only made his former teacher to grimace. "We'll need Kakashi for this. If their Sharingan works as a pair and they're able to open the same portal, we'll need him to deal with Obito. But he's not ready for it." "Not yet," Jiraiya muttered with a sour voice from the far end of the room. Naruto let out a snarl both in frustration and in protest, but his father was faster. "No. We can't wait until he reaches that level." It's true that in Naruto's original timeline only Kakashi was able to follow him into that dimension, but here Obito is younger, slower and inexperienced with his abilities. He is vulnerable. But so is Kakashi. I won't drag him into this. We can do this without him. Naruto, you told me that I was able to free Kurama from his influence. For this I had to touch him. I can keep up with him. Naruto's only answer was a weak nod, not having the energy to even say a faint yes. The yellow flash let out a sigh, strolled next to his son and squeezed his shoulder encouragingly. "It will be soon over, I promise. But we have to go over one more thing." Naruto glanced up at him through his bangs and slowly nodded, but not until Minato sent him a reassuring smile that somehow charged him up a little. "I need to speak with Kurama." Naruto didn't answer, but instead gathered enough chakra for one single shadow clone and let the technique free. The clone's features almost instantly began to morph, his canines expanded as his whisker marks thickened. And the blue of his eyes slowly turned into crimson. A second later the replica's once distressed expression turned into calm and collected, almost cold, but still curious as it turned toward the Kage. "What do you want to know?" Minato took place on the arm of the chair next to Naruto and folded his arms. "Everything about the night Kushina and..." He took a breath to steady his drumming heart and continued, "I died. Everything about Obito and his abilities he had showed during that event." Naruto winced and squirmed deeper into the chair, but he stopped fidgeting as soon as father leaned toward him, their shoulders met and the small contact and his warmth immediately calmed him down. Kurama observed the small exchange for a silent moment before answering. "I wasn't entirely aware of what was happening outside while Obito controlled me, but I do remember Naruto's birth and the sealing. However, I don't think that will happen the same way in this timeline due to our arrival. I can tell you more about it, but it would be a waste of time. What you really need to know more about is Obito's current power, style and techniques. And that can only be achieved by inspecting the fight between you and Obito, between the birth and the sealing. But unfortunately, I was demolishing Konoha at the time, so I didn't actually see any of it. The only one who would be able to truly speak about it is you, Minato." The fox paused, and a sly smirk spread over his face. "There is a way you can get this information from your future version. Isn't that right, Yondaime?" Minato raised his brow, eyes curiously darting over Kurama's features. The fox let his smirk widen and the Kage grimaced at the fact that he'd been caught. In the end, he lifted one shoulder and let it drop. "Well, I think I could contact my older self in the seal." Naruto quirked an eyebrow and suspiciously observed his father's nervous body language. "Hey, what? How do you know about him?" "Well, you know there was this time when I poked at your seal and me and him had a minute to talk." Minato shut his mouth with an audible click and waited for his son's judgment. No more lies. No more secrets. That was their deal, and thanks to the fox they were starting to act that way. He winced and stayed in silence, but thankfully before the situation could escalate any further, Kurama stepped in with a pleased smirk. "It doesn't matter, and it isn't necessary. You have those memories, Naruto. Minato showed you what happened back then." Silence replaced the previously tensed conversation, each man letting himself to drift into his own thoughts. Kurama glanced down at Naruto, this time addressing his partner who sat there, eyes closed, his brow furrowed into one troubled line. You should speak to that Yamanaka. Naruto didn't answer, not really noticing that he was being addressed until he couldn't shake off a nagging feeling that eyes were trained on the back of his head. So he slowly forced his eyes open to realize that everyone's attention was glued on him. A sheepish smile spread across his face and he scratched the back of his head. I wasn't really listening. Kurama let out a snarl and repeated, I said that you should speak to that Yamanaka and ask for help. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Inoichi? No, you idiot, not that one. The girl in your mindscape. Inu or Ino or whatever her name was. Her skills will come in handy now, Kurama growled, smacking Naruto on his crown. The blonde furrowed his brow while he nursed his throbbing head and opened his mouth to retort with something nasty, but the fox was faster as it barked out. Just do it. Okay. Geez, you're snappy today, Naruto muttered, but did as he was told. He closed his eyes and forced his heart to beat slower, almost freezing together with his chakra flow. One more heartbeat and he could already smell the odd and invading smell of the old books and scrolls around him. He slowly opened his eyes and she was there, watching him curiously. Her eyes drifted toward her own arms, her eyebrow already raising. It feels strange, muttered Ino, her eyes glued on her hands, observing as she clenched and unclenched them. It's different than last time, she explained to the puzzled Naruto and took a step toward the stunned boy. I gave you some additional chakra this time, boomed Kurama's voice from everywhere, the vitrine's windows tinkled as the deep tenor shook them. Ino glanced up to the high ceiling and took another step toward Naruto. Then another and she continued until she was only an inch away from him. Naruto blinked when something warm brushed against his cheeks and it took another second for him to realize it was Ino's breathing. He raised his suddenly trembling arms, pausing on the way for a moment until he met with Ino's encouraging smile and tucked back a platinum blonde tuft behind Ino's ears. You're real, Naruto exhaled, his voice shaking from excitement. No. Not real. But solid, Ino whispered, and in the next moment he was in her embrace, her arms almost painfully closed around him. He didn't hesitate to return it. They stayed like that for seconds, minutes, who could know how long, until Kurama broke the precious moment. We're running out of time. With my chakra, you should be able to show one of your tricks to Naruto. What tricks? Naruto asked, as he slowly untangled his arms around his comrade. He made one last regretful glance at the still smiling Kunoichi and took a step backward to gain some space. You mean she has a way to show my memories to the others? Without all those creepy devices? Yeah, I do, Ino agreed and also took a step backward. But you won't just show him your memories, you'll transfer them. Transfer? Naruto furrowed his brow, carefully observing as the girl slowly running through a short chain of hand signs. When she finished, she extended one graceful finger and gradually touched his forehead. Then it happened. One moment it wasn't there, then in the next it was. A memory of a jutsu that until now he hadn't even heard of, let alone known. Not only the necessary hand signs, but everything that was needed to perform it. The amount of chakra, how it should flow, how he should hold his pinky a little further apart than in the original description to reduce its chakra cost. He could feel the memory even in his muscles. He let his mouth drop and glanced up at her, eyes wide, still puzzled. Her smile softened, then suddenly widened into a cheeky grin. What? You thought it was only you who got better as the years went by? Naruto let out a snort and shook his head. No. Of course not. Naruto suddenly froze, his eyes bulging. Hey! So you remember after all? Ino shrugged, but the cheekiness was still in her smile. I lied, she giggled and gave a small shove to the shinobi. Go now. Show them what Uzumaki Naruto is capable of. And do me a favor. Give Madara what he deserves. The boy let his smile grow until it finally reached his eyes. He nodded, and after one last grateful glance at his comrade he left his mindscape. There was a spike in Naruto's chakra and Jiraiya took a step toward the blonde as soon as heart rate sped up to its normal pace. So? What happened? Naruto let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding in and cracked his eyes open to peer up at his expectant companions. A wide grin spread across his face, wide enough to reach his eyes once more. I've got a cool jutsu from her, he burst out happily, and only a hair-thin line held him from literally bouncing over the office. He suddenly straightened himself and stepped in front of his father, his previous fatigue nowhere to be found, his hands by now on the first symbol. I can show you what you want to know, now. He finished the signs in union with the sentence, one finger already extended toward his father's forehead. Naruto paused, waiting for Minato to agree. A small chakra sparkle greedily leapt from the fingertip to Minato's skin, and as soon it reached him, he nodded almost immediately. The Jinchuriki's grin slowly faded away as seriousness took over its place. He touched his father's cool forehead and released the technique he was until now holding back from trigger. It took only a second, a short, fragile moment of stillness before the storm. Then suddenly it was there with the speed and ferocity of a thunderbolt. Minato flinched a shaky step backward and covered the distance between himself and the armchair Naruto had previously occupied to literally crash into it as his foot bucked under the sudden pressure of the overwhelming memories. The fight with Obito was short, like all should be with the yellow flash involved. Obito was fast, and he couldn't deny that he was smart, but at the end everything depended on speed. And in that, Minato was still superior. But more memories slipped through about that night. His son really tried to be careful, restraining most of the events which weren't connected to the actual fight with Obito and his abilities, but Naruto couldn't hold back everything. Flashes of images, smells and sounds flared in Minato's mind for moments before fading back to where they came from. A scream penetrated the darkness. Kushina, Minato dimly recognized. It was high and pained, but full of anticipation and impatience. Another wail, this time a baby's. A flare of overwhelming joy and the sweet smell of vanilla, and then it was gone. He tried to grab onto that small fragment but it was to no avail. It slipped out from his hands like fine silk. A different scene, this time sharp and clear. An orange mask flashed up, then the iron tang of blood. A baby screamed in protest as it was tossed in the air. He was more able to smell the invading stench as dozens of bomb tags flared to life on Naruto's skin than actually see it, then it was thankfully gone. A flicker of a crimson tail, and a whole district vanished from Konoha. Another scream came from the distance, dulled by the bluster around him, but he was still able to recognize the pain in its high pitch. Gamabunta grunted and shifted beneath him, the woods groaning under his weight. Golden chains shot out in desperation toward the rampaging fox. A final picture made him seal his mouth shut with an audible snap and curl his hands tightly around the edge of the armchair. A flash of Kushina's face, lips and chin painted ruby from the flowing blood, but she was still smiling, softer than he had ever seen her. It hurt. It hurt more than he could even understand. The knowledge that Kushina would be gone. Then it suddenly stopped as grim determination took the place of his previous misery. Minato blinked, desperately trying to clear away the white fog that suddenly occupied his whole vision and mind. It gradually cleared and the Kage let out a calming breath and ran a hand along his hair. When he finally gathered his shattered psyche, he disregarded everyone else around him, his eyes found a small puffy cloud outside of the window and locked his gaze onto it. He watched as it slowly shifted with the wind, edges gradually fading until there were no recognizable forms, only the azure sky. For the first time he felt the weight of that night. The true burden of the responsibility Naruto had been carrying for all these months. He let out another breath and finally closed his eyes and slumped back in the chair with a soft, inaudible exhale. What have you done, Obito? The night before the departure was peaceful, silent, and the first day of October was chilly. The winter showed itself for the first time, frost glimmering on the windows of the Hokage mansion. Naruto watched the gleaming crystals closely, hands crossed on the ledge, his chin resting on them, his nose almost touching the cold glass. A shiver ran up on his spine at the frosty sensation on his face, but it died down halfway in the warm room at his back. Clothes ruffled behind him, the constant, faint, but sweet smell of vanilla became more apparent as Kushina stepped next to Naruto. He tapped into nature's energy, letting it flow through his coils until he found the tiny life at his back he was looking for. The presence was small, almost unnoticeable even with the barest hint of senjutsu in him, but it was enough to make sure that the small life was all right. The woman ran her fingers along his shoulder until she reached his hairline, and the boy let his eyelashes drop together with the last driblet of senjutsu, giving himself up to the warm sensation of the caressing digits and to the rare moment of peace in his life. Kushina's fingers stroked the small crack between his cheek and chin, seeking more purchase, and he obediently tilted his head to give in to her demands. Her hand slid over his cheek, fingers gently tracing the lingering baby fat on his face. He allowed himself to be lulled into a half-awake, half-asleep state for minutes, not caring about anything, only concentrating on the warm sensation of his mother's touch he'd so longed for. A forgotten crack cried out under a new weight as Minato stepped onto the ancient old wooden floor. Letting out a sigh, Naruto finally straightened himself. Kushina didn't let her touch to break, not even for a second, her hands shadowing her son's slow movement until Minato was next to them, silently watching the small exchange between mother and son. Only then did she move to drop her hand, but Naruto stopped it. Not forcefully, but with a mere tilt of his head as he chased her hands in their motion. It was enough for her to stop and let her son to press himself once again into the flat of her hands for one last second before he breathed a small kiss on her palm. Minato's lips curved upward, but he still didn't dare to break the moment between them. He already felt himself as an intruder from the moment Naruto straightened. The blonde finally glanced up at him, eyes foggy, face flushed, and he looked almost feverish, but not because of illness but most likely of happiness. The Kage leaned toward his wife to seek contact, his hand already on Naruto's shoulder, the other carefully wrapped around Kushina's waist. They gave up themselves to this small, peaceful moment entirely, doing nothing, thinking nothing, only reaching out for all the warmness around them that embraced the reunited family on this chilly night. Before they departed tomorrow morning, the air at the gates was heavy with the different moods mixed around. The anticipation, the fear, the tension, and the sadness of those who came to say farewell to their loved ones. The excitement of those who thought this would be their great chance to show their skills and to step up on the imaginary ladder of the hierarchy. And the cold calculation how some saw this mission. Kushina hugged her husband under the shadows of a giant oak tree, the leader utilizing the motion to steal a small kiss from the woman, shrouding away their intimacy from unwanted eyes. Kakashi let the grimace he'd been holding back spread across his face, his concentration falling only for a second before turning back to Naruto, who checked his backpack for the third time in one row in the last 5 seconds. Jiraiya chatted casually with Kitsuchi at the other side of the road, while the ever-loud Kyumo Jinchuriki for once silently listened to their conversation. Naruto finally made sure for the 4th time that yes, he hadn't left anything at his room, and yes, even the spare barrier seal was also in his pack, and he let his eyes roam the small crowd. A lonely Anbu waited silently next to the watch house, face shrouded by the cold porcelain mask. Naruto couldn't recognize the crow it symbolized, but even without his nose or his other senses, the untidy mass of black hair was more than enough to know it was Shursui. Sarutobi Hiruzen watched the gathered shinobi from a distance, his pipe empty of fire or even any herb, but he still chewed it absently. He was too disturbed to refill it before he departed from home, and this little slip would stay with him until his grave. The professor simply forgot it in his own mixed emotions. Hopefully no one would ever notice it, especially not Jiraiya, or he would be the living dartboard of his teasing about his encroaching senility. The aging Kage let out a long and weary sigh, which really told tales about how old he felt at the moment. He let his eyes roam on the gathering, observed Kushina's round stomach, then his eyes drifted up to the very same boy who will be soon born if everything went according to the plan they discussed. There was a shift in the atmosphere around the foreign shinobi as Minato stepped next to his son at the enormous wooden gates, closely followed by Kushina. A slight unease, but they shook off the feeling soon enough. The Kage ran his eyes over the gathering, resting his sight on each of the volunteers before settling down once more on his wife's nervous expression. She already chewed her lower lip raw since morning, and only the fox's chakra kept it from bleeding. The woman's lips trembled and she shot forward, disregarded the curious eyes around them and flung herself into Minato's arms, dragging Naruto with her in the same motion to unite them in a desperate hug. The Kage gave a final kiss to his wife to lull away her anger for not letting her coming with them and to whist her anxiety with the small contact. Naruto mimicked his father, planting a small kiss on her other cheek. "Everything will be all right. Promise?" she murmured into Minato's neck. A weak and pointless question, but Kushina still wanted to hear it. Needed to hear it. "I promise. I won't let anyone die on my watch. I don't go back on my word." Minato's lips turned upward in a small smile and kept the contact for some time, before he finally broke it with regret to lead the mismatched team into the heart of the mountain's graveyard. The speed Minato had been dictating was far from his reputation, but also far from leisure. They traveled with a semi-comfortable, but still efficient pace, careful to not overstrain the unusual group. The time traveler quickened his pace to catch up with his father, running with him in complete sync. They jumped in union, flung their legs at the same second and even their hearts pick up the same rhythm with time. Naruto couldn't keep up the silence anymore and glanced at his father. "So, how are we gonna do it? I mean, I know we went through a bunch of options, but what do you think?" Minato furrowed his brow in concentration, making a bigger jump from a branch than was actually necessary. "We'll follow the tactics as we discussed. And we definitely don't need any reckless moves from you. You know that I might be forced to use all my strength, right?" The Kage didn't answer, but his face hardened in comprehension, so Naruto continued. "What will we do then? How will we explain Kurama's chakra to the others? I mean, I'm pretty sure Octopops would be able to feel him." The blonde tilted his head backward where the loud jailer scribbled into his notebook while traveling, disregarding the danger of falling flat on the ground by sidestepping a branch. "Take it easy. We'll cross that bridge if we came to it." Minato tossed back his answer casually, but he wasn't so confident in it as he sounded. This was actually a pretty good question. He was sure that he'd receive tons of demanding letters from all over the elemental nations when they finished this mission. He was even surprised that the Kage let any of their shinobi to join them with so little information he had provided. "Come, join me to save the word." Who would answer that kind of ridiculous call? And here they were, a dozen shinobi mixed from every nation, traveling peacefully side by side except for some small bickering. But it eased away the tension between them rather than fueling it. "So, about my dad." Minato glanced to his side, and Naruto continued. "You know, the you who lives in my seal. What did he say?" Minato couldn't help but smile sadly at the eagerness in Naruto's tone. How much had he longed to hear from his parents? How lonely had he been? How much of that had been Minato's fault? "He's proud of you, you know," Minato told him. Naruto's eyes widened, and he slowed to a stop. "Really?" he whispered, his expression desperate and anguished in equal measure. Minato stopped as well, turning with a warm smile like beams of sunlight, doing his best to mask his own sadness and guilt. How could he not be? Naruto's face crumpled, and he sniffed and stubbornly swiped at his eyes, unwilling to cry. At the end, he restrained his tears and instead let out a small chuckle, lighting up the previous mood. "Dad," Naruto said. What is it, Naruto? Minato turned slowly, his lips also curving upward. Thanks. Naruto's smile grew even bigger, from soft to cheeky. Come, we can't chat here all day. We've got to save the world, don't we? He nodded toward the horizon as an invitation to continue their journey, but he didn't actually wait for Minato to follow him. He jumped high, higher than was actually necessary, and Minato has to force some chakra into his legs to catch up to his relative. The Kage made a side glance at his relative, and his mind wandered back to the conversation with Shikaku before the Chunin exams. Your brother's going to be a very important ninja. His thoughts lingered in that memory for one more second before dismissing it. It was so accurate, but no one could know the whole truth. His son already did become a very important ninja, just not here, just not now. Minato gracefully landed in the middle of a clearing, his motion followed by the small team through the darkness of the night. On his signal, the team moved like one single man, and within minutes, the camp was standing, a small fire already playfully cracking in the center. The shinobi settled around it, filling the clearing with warm chatter, fueling the small heat to grow out the meadow. Minato glanced at his side, first at Jiraiya then at Naruto, holding their gaze only for seconds, but still having a whole conversation with that small contact. The Kage nodded, then straightened, gaining everyone's attention immediately. We missed the detailed briefing before departure. Now, I'm going to make up for this shortcoming. He held each of their gaze in the flickering firelight, then continued. The enemy we are dealing with is an Uchiha. He has the ability to make himself intangible and he can use teleportation. We already know that he teleports his body or its parts to another dimension to become intangible. Minato made a pause to inhale the cold night's air and went on. The goal of this mission is to prevent the Fourth Shinobi World War. Minato bargained for some kind of reaction. Any kind of reaction. But only the narrowing eyes and tensing muscles indicated that they even heard him. Finally, B let out a snort and shook his head. Don't you feel offended, but the Third War barely ended. How could you stop another by killing one man, my brother? It'll take some time for the nations to prepare, and that'll be the time for the ninja to beware. We don't have time. He's aiming for the Bijus. He wants their power and by taking them, he'll unbalance the nations. Naruto barked into stillness and all the attention was glued on him in an instant. The person we are looking for is... He glanced up at his father for reassurance, but none came. Is Uchiha Madara. All sounds died down around the small group. Nothing could be heard, not even the unnaturally quiet breathing of Shinobi. Even the crickets had fallen silent. A chill seemed to fall over the air. Naruto vehemently shook his head, his chakra shifting, growing inside him, until it reached a certain level and the technique triggered. A clone popped into existence, then poofed once more to transform into an alto-familiar person. The Uchiha Madara he knew from the future stood in his crimson battle gear in the middle of the meadow, several cracks slashing over his disinterested face the exact way he remembered. Long unruly hair flowed down to his back, and his eyes both glowed red. This is the real Uchiha Madara. He's dead now, but he has a backup plan. He wants to use a special technique and resurrect himself. For that, he needs him. Naruto motioned to his other side, where another clone appeared and transformed immediately. A black robe shrouded most of his body, but Obito's old orange mask with the black flame pattern viciously stood out from the blackness. Naruto measured his clone from head to toe, something squeezing his heart a little. A mix of excitement and regret. He is the one we are looking for. He's just calling himself Uchiha Madara, but he isn't him. He is Madara's tool. Forged to follow his will. To stop the war, we have to stop him. And how would you know this kind of information? Are you sure this is accurate? Asuna Shinobi straightened his back as he asked. This time Jiraiya snorted his displeasure, stabbing the young shinobi with his gaze immediately. Boy, do you know who I am? I am the great Jiraiya. Konoha's and even the world's greatest spy master. Naruto's lips curved up, as the briefing soon turned into a small bickering. The campfire was mostly gone, but the warmth of the comrades emitted more heat than a bonfire. They traveled for days, but time slipped through Naruto's hands like water or sand. It was the same sensation he'd felt during the war while he waited in Suna for Madara to finally make his move. The anticipation and the perplexity were killing him now, just like they had been back then. The days felt like hours and hours felt like minutes as they traveled. He wanted to draw out the meeting, delaying the moment as long as he could, hoping until the last minute that he would still have more time in peace with his parents and with his village. But the moments passed by with increased speed during the last weeks in the village. The hours with his father peacefully sleeping next to him in the orange light of the campfire during this travel was only a glimpse in his memories, the long hours while he listened to his breathing during the night's mere milliseconds that he could recall. When they reached the first sign of the graveyard they immediately slackened their pace. It wasn't a beacon, nor a road sign, only something that suspiciously looked like an ancient old tree, dried white from the decades of tormenting sunbeams. But at a second glance it wasn't a simple dead tree, but the rib of a once majestic animal. Maybe it once belonged to a giant summons or to an extinct brute from long, long ago. Who knew? But one thing was certain, it was the last remains of a withered age which would never come back. Hopefully Naruto's old timeline would share the same fate. The blonde bit down on his lower lip with enough force to draw blood as they passed the first bones. The familiar iron taste overwhelmed his taste buds and he clicked his tongue in displeasure in the hope to get rid of the disgusting flavor through the action. Of course, it helped nothing. Minato suddenly stopped, his right hand raised, the other already grabbing a kunai, ready to strike. The Kage slowly crouched, fingers running over a small, almost invisible trail in the ground. The faint frown deepened on his forehead as he pushed his fingertips on the ground more heavily, nails digging into the dirt as they touched the ground, listening to something only he was able to feel or hear. Naruto stepped closer and lowered himself until he was face level with his father, his own brow furrowed into an equally deep frown. A small flare of Kurama's chakra, not enough to be noticed, but enough for him to reach into its mostly hidden potential to sense those with malicious intentions. There. A small and disturbingly familiar presence. A slick feeling in the depth of his guts, until he finally reached for it to completely recognize the sensation. Similar to nature, but completely different. Twisted. Sick, like a rotting tree. Zetsu, Naruto exhaled the name with a faint snarl. Minato glanced at his son, his frown deepening, eyes sharpening as he swept them over the landscape. The creature left a weak, almost invisible trail that led deeper into the labyrinth of bones. He could clearly remember as Naruto once said that he couldn't be tracked during the war. The clones left no trail behind, no chakra, not even a footprint. They were skilled like the finest shinobi. It could be a trap, or it could be that over the years Zetsu became more skilled, just like Obito. The Kage finally made his decision and straightened. We're following the trail. Naruto eyed his father for a moment before accepting the choice he made with a swift nod, body already turned toward the direction the trail was heading. Then let's get over it. Minato silently agreed as Naruto took the lead. The group followed him on the path that led through a tunnel of ribs which once belonged to a giant, their way shrouded by the shadows cast by the enormous spine. They finally arrived to an offset, the walls covered with small squares, maybe the intakes holes of the underground tunnels and chambers where Obito was hiding, maybe simple decorations left by an unforgotten nation long lost in the centuries. The trail completely ended there. It didn't become fainter and fainter until they couldn't follow, but simply disappeared like Zetsu had suddenly become one with the earth. The Kage crouched again, his chakra tapping into the soil in the hope that he'll be able to follow the creature's way it used to enter the hideout. What if Obito isn't there? Jiraiya joined his leader this time, voice barely above a whisper. Naruto took a step to join Minato at his other side, eyeing his former teacher with a frown. He has to be here. Nagato said that he told him he'd withdraw for a month, until my birth. He's here for sure. Probably already knows that we're here. Minato hadn't lifted his fingers from the ground. They were still firmly touching the soil and with the passing seconds digging deeper and deeper into it, until one of his digits completely disappeared under the black dirt. A movement of desperation, clinging into the technique and pushing more and more of his chakra with his body into the ground in the hope that with more force, it would be able to find the presence he was looking for. His eyes darted over his surroundings. There were no visible entrances, not a door, not a trap door, nor any traces of a seal or an illusion around them. Letting out a frustrated grunt, the Kage forced his pounding heart to calm, easing his breathing until he was almost motionless to tap into another source of power, this time borrowing it from Mother Nature herself. Naruto swept his head toward his father as soon the barest hint of senjutsu brushed over him. A deep frown was carved into Minato's forehead, something he'd gotten used to over the past week. The formerly invisible lines of stress, worry and constant concentration became unconcealable ever since Naruto's true identity was unveiled. His father's face slowly relaxed, the deep lines smoothened as he finally reached the inner balance he was looking for. Unmistakable reddish markings appeared around his eyes, gradually overwhelming his skin's natural color. Seconds passed without a single twitch of a finger, until those seconds swelled into minutes of stillness. Naruto itched to move, to do something, anything, but he held still, waiting for his father to finish what he had started. Minato finally twitched with excitement, his mouths curved up and the sage mode wobbled for a moment before stabilizing back. I found them, he exhaled, and Naruto immediately reached out for the nature himself. Unlike Minato, it took only him a second to find his own inner balance. He concentrated the senjutsu around him, reaching for the essence of the beings he was surrounded by. His father's fresh presence, the joyful atmosphere which Bee and Jiraiya had been emitting. The unmovable power of Kitsuchi. The tiny aura of the bugs and animals faded into the background until he finally found a spot with darkness. Completely closed, like a door slammed shut in front of him with a loud bang every time he reached for that distance. If he wasn't concentrating to find something irregular, he would have missed it. A barrier that locked him out. Madara was smart, he had to give him credit for that at least. The hideout he had chosen was perfectly concealed from senjutsu. The first Hokage was an expert in it, he should have guessed that the bastard would do everything to hide from the Shodai's eyes. Now they only had to figure out how to get there. Naruto glanced up at the only earth user from rock, lips suddenly opening with a sharp intake of air, but closing almost immediately as he turned the idea down as fast as it came. Kitsuchi would be able to manipulate the earth, but without knowing the exact location he could blow up the whole underground tunnel. This time, he turned toward the others, assessing their skills one by one, and based on the soft ruffling at his side, his father was doing the same. After dismissing every other solution, for blue eyes were soon back at the IWA Shinobi. Minato and Naruto shared a quick, meaningful glance. The only thing they have to figure out was how to show him the exact location. Transferring the memories maybe would be enough. What if we just blow up the whole place? Naruto blurted out without thinking, earning a hard slap on his crown from Jiraiya for his bright idea almost immediately. Minato slowly shook his head after erasing the small curve on his lips, and his son became serious again. The Kage steadily chewed on his lower lip and let out a small humming noise, his eyes scrutinizing Kitsuchi from head to toe for long seconds until the shinobi uneasily fidgeted from foot to foot under Minato's gaze. Letting out a sigh, he talked to ease away Kitsuchi's growing stress. The problem is that we know the exact location, but only by sensing. We don't know how to get there, and somehow we have to get around 50 feet of rock to reach the first chamber of the underground tunnels. Or at least we think it is the first open place there. But we're only guessing. The brawny man scrunched up his face in thought and kept silent for some time, carefully considering his abilities and the possibilities. Finally, he opened his mouth to speak. If I know the location at least approximately, I can send down an earth clone, or with more, I can try to dig a tunnel. Minato almost immediately shook his head. Digging out a whole tunnel which everyone could use would take too much time, and Naruto couldn't take it anymore. Come on. Just give one of your kunai to the clone and you can teleport the whole bunch there. The Kage closed his mouth with a snap, and after silently staring at his relative, he finally let out a chuckle. Nice idea, but it won't be necessary. See? He poked toward the far end of the offset, and Naruto was able to catch the last glimpse of a tail as an animal slipped through the thick bushes. The team narrowed his eyes and watched as the leaves rustled and never stilled. A draft. That had to mean an entrance. Within 5 minutes, they were heading deeper and deeper in the tunnels until they reached a passage. The giant rocks and debris over the floor told a tale about a barricade that once closed up the entrance of the hideout. They stepped over the remains to forge deeper through the dark tunnels. Every available surface was covered with thick, ancient old seal arrays which, even being black, somehow seemed to be viciously pulsing in the dark cavern. The shadows dancing and flipping with the rhythm of the thrumming. But beside the seals, there wasn't anything to look at. It wasn't abandoned or ruined, but it was utterly and completely empty. Naruto expected leftovers from the old nation, but he couldn't even spot the remains of a rotting wooden chair, or a rusty shuriken at his feet. The place looked dusty for sure, but beside the faint dirt layer over the floor there were no signs of the previous occupants. The blonde suddenly stilled, when a small, almost invisible thin line caught his eyes in the soft powder. He gently elbowed his father in his side and pointed a finger at the faint trail. After a second of consideration, Minato nodded and led the team deeper inside the underground maze. The next time they had to stop was for the first sight of civilization. The floor was now crystal clear, free of the dust which had shrouded everything else they'd seen. They reached a smaller room with an examining table in the middle. The sharp, pointy and distressing stainless steel accessories all over it were screaming about a hospital, or more likely an operating room. However, the most disturbing things were the innumerable glasses over the wall, each of them containing a slowly floating Sharingan eye in an unidentifiable greenish liquid. Naruto gulped as they passed beside them, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that more than one of the eyes had turned in the liquid to follow their movement as they went by. He swore that one even blinked at him, and only his dignity restrained him from jumping into Minato's arm. They finally left the room only to find themselves in a much bigger chamber, and Naruto's feet remained rooted to one spot as soon he stepped inside. Minato also stilled behind him, his eyes locked on his son's clenched hands and his slightly but continuously trembling back. He glanced over Naruto's shoulder, his frown deepening at the sight. A giant, humanoid entity sat cross-legged in the middle of the chamber, dominating the space. Its limbs were bound by shackles, something hung between its teeth, similar to a scroll, and Minato grimaced as soon he spotted the spike-like protrusions on its back. Naruto found himself face to face with his own nightmare. It was different than he remembered, but still too familiar to the thing that sometimes haunted his dreams. Minato put a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, and Naruto flinched, too overwhelmed by his own memories, by the battle cries in his own head that until now had suppressed his father's low voice. "That thing is..." Minato murmured, his mouth suddenly dry from the dust, his eyes running over the enormous statue once again, bigger than anything he'd seen until now. He couldn't finish his sentence. Instead he gulped it down. The Geto Mazo. The empty vessel of the 10-tailed beast, Naruto continued for him, eyes locked on the blindfold on its face. He forced his feet to move and finally took one hesitant step toward the statue. More followed the first, and the small group soon stopped forth in front of the giant. An empty bed occupied the middle of the giant chamber, and in front of them there was one more piece of furniture. One single chair, or based on its size a real throne carved from the stump of an ancient tree. Naruto feared they would find Madara's drying corpse sitting in it, but thankfully it was empty. His eyes traveled up toward the branch-like protrusions to spot several white Zetsu clones motionlessly hanging, some fully grown, others not even close with their amorph face, missing eyes, mouth, limbs or other body parts. He couldn't get rid of the image of a gallows tree with several corpses silently swaying together with the wind. He even heard as the tree cried out under the weight and cracked as a breeze rocked the bodies. Naruto locked his gaze on the nearest clone and the imaginary tree blattered again under the weight. Another crackle echoed in his mind and this time Naruto uneasily shifted. So did the image in his head as one of the corpses slowly turned in the wind, revealing a rotting face, lips dragged back into a snarl, exposing yellow, pointed fangs. Suddenly the creature's eyes twitched, and Naruto realized that he wasn't the only one hearing the cracking noise. It filled the whole chamber as the clones woke from their slumber. He took a step backward and glanced at his side to check up on his companions. Minato also locked his eyes at the nearest clone, a dozen of his kunai already in his hands, ready to tore through the cave and impale any creature which dared to attack or even twitch a finger. An undeveloped clone crashed down into the soil, but slumping not far away from the group. Without proper working limbs, its fate was sealed. A second later, like it was a starting sign, several others followed. Unnaturally white vines snapped continuously, releasing their burden. The sound thundered through the cave as it echoed back and forth, dropping hundreds of replicas in different hatching stages. Not every clone was unusable as the first one. Most gracelessly wobbled on their legs for a second before straightening. Within a minute, hundreds of clones of varying development were facing them. It's starting. Be prepared and look out for Madara. He also has to be here, Jiraiya muttered and lowered his center of gravity for better footing. One of the clones tilted his head to the side at the sound and took the first, threatening step toward the sage. Minato immediately rewarded its attempt with a kunai in the middle of its forehead. The clones buzzed to life, awakened from their slumber by the death of one of their own. A single clone roared at the back, jumping high in the sky to attack the shinobi, but it got caught in a wind release midair. More followed the first two attackers, first unsteadily, then more confidently until the small army charged and finally the two groups smashed together. Naruto whirled to the left to avoid the attack of a snarling clone and rewarded its attempts with a Rasengan, not even losing from his momentum from the turn. Another white creature leapt at him and he avoided the impact easily with a graceful jump. Glancing to the side, he spotted his father as he thrust a kunai into a clone's chest, its form slumping, but its place was almost immediately filled by two snarling replicas. The soil suddenly shook under the pressure as Kitsuchi fired one of his powerful earth release. Several rocks fall from the ceiling, dust and small debris raining on everybody, then everything stopped. After a second of foreshadowing stillness, a small crack knifed through the shaking ground between Naruto's unsteady feet. It dashed across the chamber until it reached bigger group of the white creatures and the earth opened under them, hungrily swallowing up the false bodies into the limitless pit. Someone roared in the distance, and Naruto immediately bolted toward the familiar voice. It was Jiraiya. He wasn't booming in pain, but in triumph as he bulldozed a clone with his fist, throwing the body far away to join a slowly growing pile. Naruto snorted at the sight. Within the first short minute of the fight, Jiraiya had already finished a dozen clones. At least Naruto was sure that the small hill of the slumped, dead or unconscious clones held at least that much or more. The white-haired man cried out once more, this time in rage as one of the sneakier clones was able to get behind him. However, its efforts were useless against the iron-strong blast of hair that suddenly shot out toward it, blasting its form against the wall. It was dead even before it impacted with the hard rock. A giant tentacle shot out from the side, pushing over everything in its way, be it a clone or a stalagmite. Wind howled on the other side as a shinobi from sand let go one of her attack. Meanwhile, Naruto wasn't able to enjoy the show. A clingy replica caught him by surprise at his back, and an ice-cold arm writhed around his neck, trying to choke him. The blonde's first panicked reaction was to claw at the arm, leaving long bloodless marks in the pale flesh, before cooling his head and simply throwing off the stubborn clone. It impacted with the ground with a pained grunt, but immediately struggled to get up and fight again. After a furious kick from Naruto, it finally stilled. The blonde let out a sigh and frowned while he got rid of another clone with a well-aimed punch. This time they fought with quality against quantity. The frown deepened on Naruto's face. The clones were numerous, but weak. Inexperienced and underdeveloped. An easy win. Too easy. Naruto jumped up at the motionless giant statue, darted up its arm, and settled down at the top of its head to sweep his eyes over the battle scene. The clones' number was slowly decreasing, there were more lying on the ground than actually standing and fighting. He caught flashes of Minato's golden hair here and there, and each time it glinted in the half-illuminated chamber a clone dropped to the ground. Narrowing his eyes even more, Naruto stilled and reached for the nature around them to look for those who hadn't shown themselves until now. He became one with nature once again, the familiar tingling sensation over his skin increasing until it overwhelmed him. There. He caught a glimpse of something disturbing, a presence flickering in and out of his senses, merging with nature then parting. It didn't interfere with the fight, only stopping here and there, silently observing the battle like a shadow, before reappearing somewhere else. It paused, tilted its head up towards Naruto and moved once more. It slithered up toward Naruto, the feeling similar to the ones fighting down, but still different. More defined, more powerful, more malicious and much more sickening. The blonde slowly turned to greet Zetsu properly as it slowly emerged from the statue. A familiar mismatched face materialized in front of him, slowly growing out from the figure. Half of his face was blacker than the darkest night, the other half white, paler than the freshest snow, two amber eyes illuminating the smooth face in a yellowish glow, highlighting a deep and troubled frown on it. "You caused too much trouble," it rasped. "I could say the same, Aloe," Naruto snarled as he took a threatening step toward the creature, raising his hand, and a Rasengan flickered to life between his fingers. "Where is he?" Zetsu tilted his head to the side questioningly. "He? What do you mean by that? Where is Obito?" Naruto growled and dashed toward Zetsu, his technique roaring as it bit into the place where a second ago his opponent was. "Obito?" This came from behind, and Naruto whirled and tore into empty space once again. A dulled, mocking laughter filled the space around him, propelling the blonde's frustration toward its limit. Naruto let out an animalistic growl and a chakra flame flickered at his shoulder and died down almost instantly, but it was more than enough to cut down the laughter completely. Finally, Zetsu emerged in front of Naruto, the previous frown again on his face as he observed the blonde more cautiously this time. His eyes flickered over his face, then settled behind Naruto. "I haven't heard that name for a long time," another voice stated, and Naruto tensed to the breaking point. With his sage mode near the end, he was still able to sense another presence as it flickered to life behind him, jumping to their reality. Everything stilled as the last remains of sage chakra flowed out of him, like fine sand from his fingers. The Uchiha hummed behind the blonde, and Naruto roared in blind rage in response. Golden chakra hurled to life around him, thundering around him like a real maelstrom, demolishing everything in his way as he slammed into Obito. Minato glanced high above them as soon he sensed the first flicker of the enormous chakra. Seconds later, like a bomb, it boomed all over the place, lighting up the until now half-illuminated cave with a golden hue. Something hit the floor, tearing a long line through the hard stone, sending dust and debris all the way until it reached the other side of the cave and stopped. A golden blur dashed next to Minato, darting toward the farthest end of the chamber, where the thing had stopped. Without hesitation, he followed his son a millisecond later. Something cracked deep under the chamber, deep enough to shake the earth's very core as Naruto roared through the middle of the thick dust cloud towards Obito at the other end of the cave. His mind was empty, focusing on nothing but the envisionment of a limp body in the middle. Everything stilled around him as he dashed through the previously fighting groups. Jiraiya paused in the middle of choking an underdeveloped clone, his eyes flickering to where Naruto's golden figure blurred past him. However, he was too slow to truly track the boy's movement, too slow to keep up. Before he'd even turned, Naruto had already passed by Killer Bee as he stood in the middle of the chamber, mouth dropped open as Kurama's chakra licked his side for a millisecond. Even though Naruto wasn't aware, someone was able to follow his movement. Barely, but still able to stay close to heal. Minato hurtled past the Kyumo Jinchuriki only a second later than his son, but he was still able to recognize the familiar expression on B's face, stunned realization. Minato pushed more chakra into his already straining muscles with a grunt and sprinted toward his son's blurring form. It had been a while since he had to push his limits, and his endurance had been stretched more than ever before in the last few seconds. His son finally breached the dust, and the thick cloud shrouding him concealed the golden light which had been illuminating the whole chamber. Without the warm light, Minato's soul weighed heavier in the ominous atmosphere. He reached the border of the fog a second later than Naruto, and with a swift jump, he followed his son into the unknown. There was a flicker of chakra, shrouded by the unsettling of soft dust and debris. It was painfully familiar, but still different from what he remembered. The last time he felt it, it was cheeky, restless, and warm. But now, the warmth was nowhere to be found. Instead, Obito's chakra felt sticky, disturbing and colder than a glacier. There was another spike, dangerously close to the other murky one, but it was the opposite to Obito's. Naruto's essence flared once more, reminding Minato of the first beam of sunshine after a long, dark storm, warm and full of life. The two life essences burst in unison in the next millisecond, and Minato heard a thud. Then suddenly their chakra signatures were gone, completely erased. The Kage blindly dashed toward where he'd last felt the two presences collide, but he only found an empty crater. Minato let out a growl in frustration and swept his head to the right where something clattered, probably two kunai. But it was gone again. He dashed to the left where the two presences flickered back to life, and this time he was able to see a glint of Naruto's golden fire, feeling its heat as he immediately reached out to grab his son. He curled his fingers but only managed to grab empty air. Minato let his nails dig into his fist, his arm dropping to his side in defeat. He dashed forward again, but the result was the same as before. With every passing second in each failed attempt, it reminded him more and more of an insane game of tag, feeling less like a life or death battle between shinobi. He wanted nothing more than to join his son's side, and he was failing miserably. He was afraid of Naruto's reaction since he couldn't predict what he would do to Obito. First he'd been shouting that he wanted to speak to him, save him, lead him out of the shadows, and his eyes shone with the same determination he was declaring. But in the next moment that resolve cracked, and Minato could clearly see the doubt seeping through. The blinding power that had exploded from Naruto afterwards frightened Minato. It was full of rage and emotions he never would have thought to associate with his son. He himself wasn't even sure of his own emotions, but he was sure of one thing: he would never let Naruto to sink down into the pit of vengeance. Minato shook his head to clear his thoughts and concentrated. There was another flare of chakra, another jump, and another failure. Minato let out an animalistic snarl in his frustration, his hands blurring through the necessary hand signs, chakra already whirling inside his coils like the tornado he was about to unleash. He stopped, stilled for the briefest of moments, and let it all out in a single blast. The wind jutsu exploded, banishing the thick dust and the debris, finally ridding him of his blindness as the air was swept clean. Minato blinked a few times to clear his eyes before he glanced around. The battle surrounding him was close to the end. There were significantly more clones on the ground than on their feet. Maybe close to a dozen were the only ones left fighting, and even they were slowly being picked off. The rest could deal with them. Instead, he would focus on finding his son. He narrowed his eyes as he searched. It wasn't hard now that he was able to see. Naruto's bright golden chakra brightly flared every time he dashed in the dim cave as he jumped at Obito, but following their movement and joining his son was significantly harder than spotting him. This time he reached for the permanent seal he had carefully crafted on Naruto's back almost a year ago close to the country border when he was still Toraku. Free of the burden he was now carrying, back when he wasn't his son from the future but his younger brother, struggling with memory loss. Minato let out a small sigh. Everything was much easier back then, for both of them. He didn't have to worry about Kushina's and his own death, or about the downfall of the Shinobi word and the rise of Madara and the Jubi. Minato cleared his mind with a shake of his head. He had other things to worry about at the moment. He ran through a chain of hand signs and jumped high, unleashing hundreds of marked kunai on the ground before landing on the earth with a soft thud. Then he closed his eyes and stilled, reaching for nature's energy to sharpen his senses so he could really focus on his son's chakra. It flickered back and forth, disappearing and reappearing as the two bodies tore through dimensions, vanishing only to reappear a second later. There. This time he got the marker. Not the complete connection, just the rhythm of the fight. But it was enough to finally join his son. A flicker of his chakra and he was gone, only to reappear at Naruto's side. As soon as he landed, Minato immediately went for his son, finally succeeding as he reached for the soft fabric of Naruto's sleeve, gripping it like his life depended on it. The chakra flames licked his skin, but they did him no harm like real fire would, merely warming him and soothing his aching muscles. It felt similar to nature's energy, but still different. Not so smooth, or defined, still wild, untamed and rough with a density that surpassed his every expectation. A Rasengan roared to life in Minato's other hand and was thrust toward Obito immediately after he'd secured his hold on his son. The Uchiha let the attack slip through him and jumped backward to gain some distance. He landed smoothly, his body shimmering as he twisted and retreated to his dimension. Minato, utilizing the small pause in the fight, raised his eyes to finally meet with his son's hazy crimsons. Minato shot him a disapproving fatherly grimace, immediately stilling his son, clearing Naruto's eyes of the overwhelming rage that had previously dimmed their ever-present shine. The time traveler righted himself and sheepishly scratched the back of his head. "Sorry, I got carried away." Minato snorted and shook his head. "Who would have guessed? What a nice family scene we've got here," Obito mocked, reappearing behind them, his voice cold and distant. Minato immediately whirled around, dragging Naruto along with him so they were facing with their enemy at all times. He looked exactly as Naruto had shown them during their war council, the same as Minato had seen in his future self's memories. A simple black robe shrouded most of his features, but the vicious orange mask with the black flame pattern still stood out. Minato clenched his jaw so tightly that his teeth began to groan under the pressure. Minato finally cracked his mouth open, desperate to put words to what he was currently feeling, the anger, the disappointment, but failed and closed it with an audible click. The boy in front of him was shorter than Naruto but still taller than he remembered his late student being. His former easygoing presence was lost. He wasn't able to find anything recognizable in the boy in front of him. Nothing in his chakra and nothing in his posture. It was cold, distant, and arrogant. All of it completely unfamiliar. He opened his mouth once more, but failed for the third time. Finally he squeezed his eyes shut despite the close danger, in the hope that with the motion he would be able to get rid of the growing frustration. But no relief came. At least, not until he felt Naruto's gentle hand on his shoulder give him a light squeeze. He slowly pried his eyes open to face with his former student. The Kage wet his suddenly dry lips and opened them once more, this time succeeding in squeezing out his rasping voice. "Why? Obito tilted his head to the side curiously in an almost confused motion and repeated in a flat and bored tone, "Why?" Minato straightened from his stance and took a step toward the Uchiha, his voice cracked, "Why didn't you come home, Obito?" Obito took a sudden, unsteady step backward. His posture became rigid and tense, like he'd been slapped in his face and hadn't simply been addressed by his real name. After some time his muscles relaxed by a fraction, his previous arrogance and cold demeanor diminishing. He didn't answer immediately, chewing on his words behind the cold mask for a moment. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but not for the same reason as Minato's. It was raspy through anger. "Home?" He let out a loud laugh, its edge sharp with budding insanity. "I have no home. My home died together with Rin. And the same happened to Uchiha Obito. He is dead. I'm not him anymore, so don't call me that. I am no one." "No." Naruto also took a step forward. "You're Obito. Don't you remember?" "Shut up. I don't want to be anyone. I don't want to remember. But I remember." Minato continued, his voice softening. "I remember your hopes and dreams. I remember the way you'd always say that you'd definitely become Hokage. But I don't care." Obito roared and dashed toward the Kage, kunai already in hand and ready to slice his neck. Minato didn't wait for Obito to arrive. He hurled himself to the side, his son's sleeve still clenched tightly in his fist, and tossed Naruto out of the attack's range. The blonde time traveler collided with the hard ground with a surprised grunt, but immediately hopped to his feet, already in motion to get back into the fight. Minato jumped, his feet and fist lashing out with deadly accuracy, but his attacks slipped through Obito like he was nothing but empty air. Naruto joined the fight with a roaring Rasengan, sharpened with wind and fire. It glowed with a brilliant light, like the white-hot steel in the hands of an experienced smith before it was forged into the sharpest sword. It shrieked as it bit into the air, and Naruto slammed it against the Uchiha's chest, but it wasn't able to make solid contact. It slipped through his chest easily, meeting no resistance until it hit the ground under Obito. One of Naruto's shadow clones popped into existence, sacrificing itself to stop one of Obito's attack aiming at Minato's blind spot, vanishing soon after as it was struck in the middle of his face. Its original whirled to the side to face with their opponent and immediately threw himself at him. There was no need for big or fancy jutsu, only speed counted in this battle. And in that, they had the upper hand. They just hadn't figured out how to utilize their advantage, or more specifically, how they could force Obito to remain solid for enough time for at least one of their attacks to reach him. Minato glanced at his son, meeting his eyes and holding the gaze for a moment, then nodding as he saw the understanding that flashed through them. Before the battle they'd gone over several tactics for how they could force Obito to leave them an opening, and now was the time to put them into motion. Naruto reached into his pocket and fished out a small piece of paper. He inched closer to the battling duo, and when Minato jumped backward to gain some space, Naruto slammed the tag down on the soil. A faint blue barrier flickered to life immediately around Obito, the inside already chirping with the unleashed electricity as it danced between the four sides and Obito's body. A compact storm trapped with as much thunderbolts as the small seal was able to handle without the need of too much preparation and with super-duper fast activation. At least, that was what Minato called it. The energy sparked against Obito's skin, thousands of volts dancing between his body and the outer part of the barricade. Naruto furrowed his brows as after one single spasm of his arms, the Uchiha stilled inside the storm, eyes darting over the two blondes in triumph. The power howled once again inside the barrier, which flinched and unceremoniously collapsed, leaving behind a faint smell of ozone and an unfazed Uchiha. Only the slight, almost invisible twitch of his right shoulder and the annoyance in his eyes indicated that he'd gotten hit at all. "You're bothersome," Obito muttered at Naruto, slowly moving his shoulder and testing the muscles. He suddenly stopped and dashed toward Naruto with just as much velocity and rage as the blonde did only minutes ago. Naruto immediately rolled out of his way, a half-formed Rasengan already whirling in his right hand, but he was forced to stop. Zetsu emerged from the ground at his feet, forcing him to pause in his motion for a second to avoid him, then suddenly he felt it. It wasn't a punch, nor pain, but a twist deep inside his gut, bending his body in an unnatural way. He tried to jump, tried to move, but he was robbed of the opportunity. The dimensions already spiraled over his body, sucking him inside. Minato sucked in a long breath and let it go together with the real name of his son, not caring who would hear it, already rushing toward his former student. Obito hummed cheekily, and followed Naruto into the other dimension. Minato froze on the spot Obito had vanished, mind already whirling to find his son's Hiraition seal. But just like during the previous game of tag, it was a lost cause. And this time they didn't reappear at the other side of the cave. Obito purposefully separated them and wouldn't let Naruto go, carefully keeping the gates closed. Obito was right. "Your brother causes too much trouble," a dry voice rasped next to Minato, and he immediately turned his attention toward Zetsu, carefully observing as it slowly emerged from the hard ground. It was the first time Minato was able to face the real creature and finally see it for himself. Naruto had already told him about it, but facing it was different than imaging him. It was so similar to the other clones but still different, more defined, but also more sinister. The white half of its split face grinned, the other dark half not mirroring the emotion at all. "I like him, you know. He's funny," another voice chirped, very different from the previous one, which immediately barked back, "Shut up. Where did Obito take him?" Minato roared, but he didn't wait for an answer. A kunai flickered and danced in his hand before it landed next to Zetsu. Then Minato was gone. A millisecond later the Kage reappeared next to the stunned creature, putting more weight to his question by a whirling Rasengan. Zetsu twisted to the side, but the whirling chakra ball still bit into his flesh, tearing out a big chunk from his side. Zetsu stumbled, but he was still able to catch himself as he staggered backwards. Minato's eyes darted over his side where he landed the direct hit, but underneath the torn fabric he found a smooth white surface where he had expected to see bloody chunks and accusingly pointing rib bones. His eyes narrowed as Zetsu straightened, the wound healing with the faint hissing of steam. The lacerated edges slowly merged until the gash was completely sealed shut without any hint of the previous gaping trauma. "I'll ask you one more time. Where is Obito?" Minato raised one of his special kunai, taking a threatening step forward. Zetsu mirrored the motion backward. "In one fell swoop you've ruined an extensively prepared strategy. I knew everything about you, I watched your every step. You shouldn't know about this place. You shouldn't know about Obito or about his abilities. And you and the shinobi from the other villages should have hated each other." Zetsu glanced around eyeing the foreign shinobi one by one, before turning back to Minato. "Yet, here you are, fighting by each other's sides. I'm curious." The creature tilted his head to the side, emphasizing his own words. "That boy. Who is he really?" "I thought you knew everything, Zetsu," Minato mocked, spinning one of his kunai on his finger. "Now you can choose, you can answer my question willingly, or I can make you answer." Naruto stumbled as he materialized in the other dimension and hit something hard. He blinked out the sudden pain and realized with wide eyes that he was surrounded by cubes. Naruto glanced around in hurry, but there was nothing around him besides the randomly arranged and differently sized cuboids. He narrowed his eyes in the dark, waiting for them to adjust and spot the edge of the blackness, but the void was seemingly endless. He wasn't able to enjoy the sightseeing undisturbed. He had to jump out of the way to avoid one of Obito's attacks as a giant shuriken rushed straight toward his heart and dug itself into the hard ground where he'd been standing just a moment ago. Naruto settled down on top of the highest cuboid, eyes already roving to spot his attacker, but he failed to locate Obito. Narrowing his eyes, he tapped into the power that Kurama was more than eager to provide. His azure eyes slowly transformed, his pupils slitting into a narrow vertical line, his irises gradually molding from vibrant blue, passing through the whole color wheel until it settled at a shining golden shade. He felt it almost immediately, a familiar nudging feeling at the back of his head, tugging his senses toward a place where a second ago he had felt nothing. But now, the ominous presence pulsed, almost radiated. The power started to grow more and more restless inside him now that he had provoked it. He thought about restraining it for a second, but he dismissed it and it continued stretching under his skin until it broke through his veins. A golden inferno of pure energy roared to life around his body, flames viciously flickering on his shoulder, blazing against his chest. Naruto let out a growl that ferociously bubbled out from the depths of his chest. With a flicker of chakra, he surged toward Obito's hiding place, and with one simple swing of his chakra-enhanced arm, he demolished the unnatural formation. Dust and debris rained all over the place, blinding his sight but not his senses. He felt as Obito slipped away, then settled down a few blocks away. The dust gradually cleared and revealed a giant crater where a second ago the majestic block had stood, Naruto standing with his arms defiantly crossed over his chest in the middle of the destruction. The closer smaller cubes slipped to the side and collapsed, burrowing and crashing the others in their way, increasing the damage even more. Naruto's intent with the punch wasn't to actually hurt, but to channel down some of his frustration. Obito disappeared from his previous spot only to gradually rematerialize on top of another cube further away to survey the damage from a safe distance, finally facing Naruto. He let out a hum and mimicked the blonde, folding his hands over his chest. Each waited for the other to make the next move, Naruto uncharacteristically refusing to blindly rush ahead like a bull. Even if Obito was Naruto's red base. The first time Naruto saw him, his mind had emptied for a second only to be refilled with something else, something foreign to him, a feeling he until now despised with all his heart. Anger, rage and vengeance. Vengeance that suddenly bubbled out from the depths of his consciousness, melting away his sanity in everything he held dear. And he was afraid of it. Afraid of this unfamiliar emotion, afraid of the foreign concept, afraid to move on to a different path. He chose another way, completely different from Sasuke's. He wanted to forgive Obito's sins, he wanted to heal and move on, but now that he was finally facing the man here and now, he found himself unable to do so. He gulped down his whirling feelings and anxiety and narrowed his gaze when Obito's lonely but still piercing Sharingan hardened under the cold surface of the mask. This feeling, the Uchiha mused, chewing on the last word. I know this chakra, but it's different. I'm sure in one thing, though. You should not have it. The Kyuubi has been housed by Kushina and is not held by someone like you. Naruto raised his shoulder in the attempt to let it drop casually, but he paused halfway. Does it actually matter, bastard? He hissed with more venom he'd originally intended, voice dipping not with anger, but with annoyance. The man's shoulders shook in what Naruto took to mean laughter, and he shrugged. No. Not really. You've only made my job much easier. Easier for what? Naruto quirked a questioning eyebrow. Easier to capture the Kyuubi. Try it, Naruto snarled. He wanted to continue, he wanted to be cocky, to just jump and land a hard punch in the middle of Obito's face. But instead he shoved his impulsiveness down, relaxed his posture, and let out a sigh. I know why you're doing this. Oh. Obito raised one arm and tapped the side of his mask. The motion would have been cheeky if there weren't been the ice-cold tone that unmercifully cut through the silence. Then tell me. Naruto hesitated, but only for a second. You want Rin back. That I understand. But the path you chose is wrong, and I don't know why the hell you chose it. You and I, we're the same, you know? More than you realize. I know your pain, your longing. I know how much it hurts. I don't know you, and you don't know me. You know nothing, Obito hissed and defiantly folded his arms in front of his chest. You're wrong, Obito. I know you. I know about your past. I know about your rivalry with Kakashi, about your feelings for Rin. Naruto took a small step toward the tensed and now silent boy and continued with more confidence when Obito didn't back from his slow approach. Do you think Rin would be happy with this? Do you think she would want you to do this for her, that she would approve what you're doing? What you're planning to do? Do you understand that stealing the Kyuubi from Kushina would kill her? Minato would fight to save her until his last breath. Naruto narrowed his eyes and let out a calming breath and continued, I know Rin wouldn't want their deaths. She would be angry. Ashamed. Disappointed. Betrayed. You would hurt her. If you stay on this route, you're not only going to kill them, but you'll bring destruction to the whole world. You'll kill thousands trying to capture the 9 Bijou, Naruto said, forcing his body to relax even if every single nerve along with Kurama screamed at him to prepare for something to come. Then just let me capture you, the man barked flatly, his arms already rising, hands clapping together with a ram sign. Be a good boy and stay here while I get rid of that annoying bunch you brought here. Naruto's eyes widened, this time in alarm, as Obito's body bent, twisted, and disappeared inside a whirling vortex. He swept his head around, chakra flaring to sense the Uchiha but failing completely. Everything was empty and silent. He was left alone in the endless black abyss. Minato whirled to the side a second before Zetsu tried to strike him in the middle. The air rushed out of his lungs as he dashed toward his attacker the moment his toes touched the soil. He twisted in midair and gave a gentle tap at his enemy's shoulder, landing in front of him to deliver a punch. His opponent wasn't aware, but a small, invisible seal slipped from his fingertips to settle down where he had touched Zetsu's shoulder, a safe landing point for the future. Minato's lips slightly turned upward in triumph as the seal silently pulsed together with his own heartbeat. However, for a moment, he found another seal, a faint flickering one he had been desperately looking for since his son disappeared. He immediately grabbed onto the dim signal, desperately hanging onto the weak connection like his life depended on it. The air suddenly shivered in front of Minato, and he flinched several steps backward, losing the connection as soon Obito completely materialized. He let out a low growl and launched one of his kunai at his old student. However, it harmlessly passed through him. But his act wasn't fruitless. The moment the weapon should have touched Obito, the connection between Minato and Naruto's seal pulsed weakly for just a moment before it faded back to oblivion. Minato narrowed his eyes as his mind's gears turned. He swept his feet farther apart and rushed toward Obito like a bull while launching a continuous rain of kunai at his opponent. As the first weapon reached the Uchiha, the Hokage also reached for Naruto's faint seal. With a vigorous flicker of his chakra, he grabbed it, fueling the connection and pulling it closer and closer until he was able to tune it properly. Another flicker of his essence and he was gone from the dimension to join his son's side once again. Obito straightened and swept his eyes over the place when he sensed movement. Several shinobi approached him slowly, cautiously forming and closing a circle around him and Zetsu. No other clones were left standing. Every single one of them was lying on the ground, dead or unconscious. Another ninja from San joined, the circle becoming smaller and smaller around them with each passing second. Narrowing his eyes at the incoming threat, Obito kept his gaze on the nearest and most dangerous ninja. Jiraiya kept his hands on a ram seal. The Uchiha was literally able to feel as the potent chakra restlessly buzzed inside the Sannin. He inched closer, eyes narrowed into angry slits. He was only mere meters away, when Zetsu narrowed his own eyes. It was enough. Jiraiya let go of the chakra, and his hair exploded. It roared toward the two men like a real lion would, fangs of white, deadly needles ready to tear into their flesh. The mismatched man immediately sunk into the ground while the attack harmlessly passed through Obito. A tentacle shot out this time, demolishing everything which got into its way beside the indifferent Uchiha, who only narrowed his eyes at the harmless attacks. "We're finished here," Obito stated flatly to the Sannin and glanced behind his back at the reappearing Zetsu. Their eyes met, silently conversing until they followed Minato into the other dimension. Trenchant chakra whirled around Naruto like a real inferno from hell, demolishing one of the innocent cubes in an instant. The blonde let out a frustrated growl and punched the hard ground at his feet when nothing happened beside the destruction. He childishly hoped that if he let out enough chakra he would be able to tear through the dimension just like Obito and get out of this trap. Something buzzed at the base of his spine, and a millisecond later, a new presence flickered to life at his back. The Jinchuriki immediately whirled around to greet Obito with a well-aimed punch, but his eyes connected with electric blue instead of angry red. Naruto froze in mid-motion, but the momentum didn't let him stop completely. He stumbled and finally halted some steps further. "Hey," Minato greeted him awkwardly, scratching the back of his head. Naruto slowly righted himself and raised his eyes, shining with annoyance and anger, but also with relief. He bounced between punching or hugging his dad for a second before settling on the later. He returned his father's weak greeting with an equally faint, "Hey," which he mumbled into his shoulder. Naruto let out a sigh and took a step backward. "Not that I'm ungrateful, you know, but now you're also trapped here." Minato shrugged and glanced around at the foreign place. "What now? How are we gonna back?" Naruto pushed on the topic, but the Kage took his time and jumped up at the nearest cuboid and landed in a low crouch. The younger let out a sigh and hopped next to his father. "Hey, can you hear me? Or are you ignoring me on purpose?" "Hush." Minato waved a hand at the annoyed teen and closed his eyes in concentration. He had no time to waste on an explanation. First he had to verify his theory. He hoped that he'd be right. There. A small flicker of one of his seals in the real world, outside of Obito's dimension. Most likely Obito had to dodge an attack. It was short, too undefined for a full-body transportation. Naruto narrowed his eyes and silently observed as Minato's lips turned upward and lowered his hand to gently touch the surface of the cuboid. He felt a small surge of chakra, and he watched as a tiny seal jumped from his fingertips and settled down on the cube. It pulsed for another beat before vanishing from his senses, as though it had never existed at all. "Whatcha doing?" Naruto whispered, voice waving with interest as he leaned closer to his father. "I can feel my landing seals when Obito moves between the dimensions," Minato finally explained and jumped to another cuboid to repeat the process, Naruto close on his heels. "That's how I was able to get here in the first place. From now on, I can follow him here, but I need more of my seals on this side." "Cool," Naruto exhaled with undisguised awe. Minato straightened and glanced at his companion. "Give me a hand. I need to get as high as we can manage." The blonde nodded, and two clones popped into existence. Their hands immediately folded, creating a human springboard. They patiently waited for Minato to step on it so they could launch him high, which they did a second later. When Minato reached the highest point, he launched a rain of marked kunai in every direction, creating hundreds, easily thousands, of safe landing points for him. Even if Obito tried to get rid of the kunai, he wouldn't be able to spot all of them in a short period of time. Minato landed in a crouch with a soft thud, and he turned toward Naruto with a wide and satisfied grin on his face. "Done. But we have to time this perfectly. If we want to leave this dimension we have to finish him on the other side. I can only sense my seals on the other side and Obito travels between the real world and this one. And what if he doesn't come back?" Naruto slapped his cheeks with a rising fluster, his voice shaking in worry. "What if we're stuck here forever?" He started to pace up and down as he continued to travel down on the path toward panic. "He'll come," Minato stated, his voice calm and controlled as he followed his son's frantic march with his eyes, a small smile shadowing his lips. But his voice did calm Naruto down just a bit, and he stopped, if only for a second, before his eyes widened. What about the others? Naruto suddenly yelled and grabbed his father's shoulder with more force he had originally intended, his fingers digging into the Kage's flesh, making him wince. They can take care of themselves. They're pretty strong, Minato answered while he pried his son's fingers from him. He suddenly froze when something nudged the back of his head. It was like a faint flicker in his mind, a small ripple, then the feeling suddenly exploded, and for a fraction of a second he clearly sensed thousands of his seals at the other dimension. The pain hit him immediately with the speed of his own Hiraishin. It stabbed into the back of his head, gone as fast as it had come. A haggard groan escaped his tightly clenched jaw and swept his eyes over the place, looking for the Uchiha. Naruto's brows knitted together in worry, but feeling his father's sudden unease, he also prepared for an attack. Naruto reached for Kurama's chakra, a small flame flickering on his shoulder. He still glanced at his father from time to make sure he was all right. He spotted them instantly. The disgusting sticky feeling of dripping malice. He narrowed his eyes and nodded toward the nearest cube, and Minato understood the motion immediately. He edged next to his son to face their opponents. Their tendons were tight, ready to avoid a strike or start their own attack. They didn't have to wait long. Obito's voice cut through the cold silence of the anticipation in the air, its edge raspy and coarse. Minato is correct. You should worry about yourselves. The two blondes tensed even more, their muscles creaking from the pressure as Obito and Zetsu step out from the safe shadows of a cuboid, the Uchiha silently sweeping his eyes over the place, leisurely regarding each marked kunai in their way until they stopped. They both took a step backward to gain more space. Naruto inhaled and let it out, steadying his breathing in his body to borrow nature's power around them. Nothing moved for a long second, but also no power surged into Naruto's body. There were no animals, no trees, no soil, nothing around them which contained sage chakra. Everything was dead. Naruto's eyes flickered between the two, and he let out a low growl when Zetsu's mismatched lips turned upward into a knowing and mocking grin. The blonde narrowed his eyes and let Kurama's power free. First flickered under his skin, then it exploded into a golden inferno, even brighter than the sun itself. Naruto whirled, while Kurama's full power roared to life. At that, they hurtled into action like a sprinter at the sound of a gun. Minato burst toward Obito, and they disappeared from his sight in an instant. At the same moment, Naruto jumped toward Zetsu, Kurama's flames hungrily licking his body as he dashed forward. He raised a chakra arm, and an ebony black ball roared to life between its fingers. He thrust it forward, and it hit solid flesh. The attack bit into the creature's snow-white muscle, tearing away a big chunk from his chest, but it suddenly stopped. With an angry hiss, he pushed more, and the Bijou Dama finally moved but only an inch before stopping again, the power inside it disappearing. Naruto glanced up at his opponent to meet his eyes, his face uncaring, almost bored. He gathered more chakra and forced it further with another inch, tearing away more of the artificial white muscle. Zetsu did not howl, nor did he stir. He only narrowed his eyes, slowly, almost lazily raising his black arm, his fingers curling around Naruto's extended arm. The blonde blinked in surprise as Zetsu's until then stoic face morphed into a wide grin. Something stirred inside him, and it wasn't only Kurama but an ominous flinch in his gut, a feeling that he had to get out of his reach as soon as possible. He desperately tried to tear his arm away from the creature's hold but failed miserably. Zetsu's iron grip was immovable. He felt a yank inside his chakra coils, and the golden flames shuddered and faded around him. Naruto violently jerked, his power rapidly disappearing, his head suddenly spinning and too heavy to keep upright, his knees quickly growing weaker. Ink-black twines sprouted out of the black arm, and Naruto watched it, horrified as they writhed on his skin, hesitated for a second, then suddenly lunged at his arm and broke through his skin. The pain wasn't much more than a mosquito bite when it ruptured, but it did hurt when the vines started moving inside. Naruto could feel them as they rubbed against his muscles while they were tapping, searching for something. He fell on his knees from the binding pain when they finally found their prey deep inside his flesh and attached themselves to his chakra coils to suck him dry of his energy. With his fading reserves and consciousness, he reached into his deepest part to gather enough chakra for one last, desperate attack. He wouldn't be able to throw it, but he trusted that Kurama would be able to deal with the damage he was about to cause himself. The chakra stirred in his palm, weak and barely visible but still enough to form a slowly whirling ball. Then he reached for more, grabbed onto it, tugged on it, forged then blended it into the orb and thrust his wind chakra-augmented Rasengan toward Zetsu's arm still attached to his own. The technique trilled like a bird, he could feel the slight wave of it on his palms before it exploded. Blinding white light overwhelmed his vision and the never-ending darkness of the void around them, illuminating parts of it which probably hadn't been touched by light for millennia. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut. The light literally burnt his irises, and it hurt more and more with every single second as wind chakra bit into them, even though they were shrouded by his eyelashes. But thankfully he also felt as the twines snapped one by one, and Zetsu's grip disappeared when the last one broke. He stumbled out of the attack's reach, but he could still feel the hundreds of razor-sharp wind blades that had drilled into his flesh. Finally the attack died down, and the word around him stilled. He slowly opened his eyes when he heard no movement, but the only thing he saw was a blurry mess, a great green blob with spots of brown and an even bigger blue and white smudge above that. His arm ached in a calculable pattern, a familiar rhythm in sync with his own heartbeat. An all-too recognizable sound buzzed next to his ear, and Obito's leaking malice kicked him harder than one of Sakura's punches. He took a step to gain space but tripped on a lonely rock. He could hear the air shimmer next to him, caused by the Uchiha's technique. He tensed and readied himself for an attack when there was a faint thud and lashed out when someone touched him. But his strike was stopped by a hand, warm and familiar, and the world twisted around him. His stomach and mind whirled restlessly as they jumped between the dimensions. It had been a while since Minato had used the Hiraishin on him, but he still welcomed this twisted feeling with relief. When his feet eventually met with solid ground, he couldn't hold up his weight in his disorientation, and he crumpled to the ground with a loud thump, the soft grass and moss under his cheek feeling more comfortable and inviting than it should have been. He hungrily inhaled the sweet, living scent of nature around him after having experienced the sterile and isolated emptiness of Obito's pocket dimension. But he wasn't able to enjoy the stillness for long. There was a whistling sound near him, the noise of Obito's dimension opening, twisting, and swirling closed. He rolled in the other direction, away from the buzz as fast as he could to gain as much distance between him and Obito he can only managed. Weapons chimed with a high-pitched noise at the place he was previously occupied. There was a scratching as a kunai didn't met with another one but something different, then something cracked. Finally he felt Kurama's chakra stirring, filling his nearly emptied coils and worming its way toward the injury in his eyes and arm, and the pain slowly lessened. He desperately hurled once more to the side when he heard a soft thud on the green grass as someone landed beside him, but he stopped with his next inhale. He still wasn't able to see the figure clearly with his still stinging eyes and boisterous mind, but his father's scent was unmistakable. The smell of crispy green cucumber and freshly cut grass. He shook his head and blinked out the haze of his eyes. He let a sour grimace spread across his face when he forced himself into a sitting position. The motion was followed by his muscles' harsh protest. Minato griped his arm, but as soon he saw Naruto's harsh wince at the contact he loosened his hold on him, his eyebrows shooting up in worry. "Are you all right?" Naruto let out another wince while Minato lifted him up as gently as much he can. "Yeah, but here's a piece of advice, never ever let the black things touch you." Minato finally hoisted him up, his hands supporting him until Naruto shook them off. Kurama's power was stretching inside him, slowly filling him up from head to toe, until it finally filled up his aching arm, sewing together broken tissues and easing out his pain and weariness almost completely. He blinked rapidly, and with each flutter his vision was clearer until it was perfect. Only a faint shadow remained, a small and constant tension, a reminder of what had happened. He was unprepared. Despite his previous experience, his power, Madara's second violinist, was almost able to render him completely helpless. He hadn't known about Zetsu's chakra-absorbing power. That was new to him. Maybe a new technique, or maybe it was there before, he just haven't got the opportunity to use it against Naruto in the past. Future. Whatever. He shook his head and let out a low, frustrated growl, and it resonated through his whole body as Kurama joined him the moment Obito and Zetsu stepped in sync in front of them. Their postures were relaxed, superior, and even Naruto wasn't able to see under Obito's mask. He could feel the mocking grin under it. He didn't understand. He didn't understand it at all. He was powerful. He was much stronger than Obito was when he saw as Kakashi killed him, but still. He couldn't beat him. He couldn't even beat Zetsu. A small fly, a nobody. And here he was, with the power of not one, but easily two or more Kage, but still beaten, tired and drained of his chakra. And Minato? He was able to win against Obito in the past, but now he couldn't. Naruto couldn't shake off the agitation, the uncertainty, and the feeling that something was utterly wrong. But he didn't have to physically beat the Uchiha. He wasn't here for that. His eyes fall on the vicious orange mask, and his eyes widened as he caught a glimpse of a long crack on its surface. The edges were sharp, its line straight, the telltale mark of a kunai/Minato had left behind. Now the previous scratching noise finally made sense to him. He sneaked a peek at his father's narrowed eyes and swept his head back when the Uchiha shifted at the edge of his vision. The mask let out another high and pained scream, the cracks multiplying and widening on its surface with the small movement. A small orange piece fell on his shoulder, several more losing their hold. The Uchiha narrowed his eyes. "I've already used up too much time and energy on you. This time it will be over." Without a second thought, Naruto took a small step forward, and this finally focused his mind back toward the battle. The Uchiha tilted his head to the side, another piece falling to the ground from his mask, watching him curiously, waiting for his next move. Naruto didn't charge, he didn't gather chakra, he simply wet his dry lips to speak after a calming exhale. "Stop it, Obito. You can still turn around. You just lost your way. Come back. I'll show you the right path. There's still a lot of things worth living for." Naruto raised a welcoming hand. The Uchiha let out a snort and snarled, "I told you before, I have no home. And there's nothing worth living for in this reality." This time it was Minato's turn to take a step and fall in line with Naruto. "Didn't you want to become Hokage, Obito? Isn't that goal worth living for? Are you trying to lecture me now? Isn't it a bit too late? Sensei?" Obito paused for a second, while his arm slowly inched toward his mask. Another small shard fell as a finger touched its surface, and he continued, his voice sour, "However, you're always late when it's important. You're never there when you're needed. First, you let me die." A finger slipped between cold porcelain mask and warm skin, and with snail's pace pulled on it. The material screamed one last time, the false face gradually crumbling away with each small motion of his fingers as he leisurely picked at the shards and let them fall on the ground. First the upper part was gone, revealing a scarred and wrinkling forehead, eyebrows knitted into one coherent line by anger. Obito continued to remove his useless mask shard by shard, gradually revealing a single black and crimson pinwheel in his eye socket, burning with hatred and despise. Minato flinched a step backward, to the same place he'd been before. His breathing was labored, his lungs whistled with every exhale. Obito tensed his muscles in his arm, fingers curling under the last intact part of his mask, and he tore it from his face with one swift and frustrated movement, finally revealing his whole face. His lips scrunched up into a snarl, revealing his tooth as he spat, but most importantly, you let Rin die. Minato violently jerked backward another step, almost stumbling away from the raw emotion, the rage in Obito's eyes. Knowing it was Obito behind the mask was hard. But facing him, seeing the deep scars on his face, the skin scrunching up in deep wrinkles. But most importantly, the face twisted by disgust, hatred and despise. That's not true. Naruto yelped and stepped to the side, shielding Minato from Obito and his accusing glare. The Uchiha let out a humorless chuckle. But it is true. He wasn't even denying it. Naruto glanced over his shoulder at his father. The man's eyes were still wide, his face mortified, but silent, subdued. He turned his gaze back at Obito. If it was Minato's fault, then it was my fault, too. I swore to Kakashi I'd protect Rin. Kakashi also let her die. Obito bit back, arms curled into fists at his side with rage. And you, when this is over, I'll extract the Kyuubi and end this world. And then I'll be able to see her again. This kicked Minato out of his temporary stasis. His eyes sharpened and his posture was righted. He took a step forward, pushing Naruto out of his way. Do you know why Rin died? Because I know. She went to find you. Obito narrowed his eyes, but didn't move from his spot. So Minato continued. It's true that I was the one who sent her on a mission to Kusa where she left the team to search for you. I saw the reports. I even went there. And I know you were also there. You were the one who killed the missing Nin who stabbed her. And he killed her because of vengeance. Your point is? Obito asked. His point is, Naruto continued instead of Minato. That it wasn't his fault. It wasn't my fault. And it wasn't even your fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was because of the circle of hatred. And the only one who can stop hatred is you. With forgiveness. Obito stood in silence, rolling the thought over and over, before his lip twisted up in a sour half-smile, pulling his scars into a disturbing grimace, then it along with every trace of emotion vanished from his face as he glanced at Minato. Yes, sensei, you were right. I was there. I saw when he attacked her. I saw all the hatred in his eyes and I stopped him, before he could reach Rin. I didn't kill him, only restrained the shinobi. I'd fully intended to kill him, but Rin begged for his life. She pleaded for me not to hurt him, and I let him leave and spared his worthless life. Do you know what happened the that moment he was free? Naruto shook his head. He attacked me the moment I let his hands go. And when I struck back at him, do you know what happened after? Naruto gritted his teeth, already knowing he won't like the answer, as Obito continued, Rin, the sweet and innocent girl, jumped between him and the attack. I couldn't stop. It was me who killed her. I was the one who stabbed her. It gave me great pleasure to tear the missing Nin into tiny pieces afterwards. So don't preach about forgiveness. Obito's chakra flared, vicious and dangerous, Sharingan whirling in their socket as he lashed straight at Minato. A kunai glinted in the late afternoon light, the sparks ominously dancing on its surface. The Kage narrowed his eyes, all of his uncertainty vanishing as the seriousness of the situation slammed home. He swept his legs to gain hold, a hand raising, electric blue chakra already whirling in his hand, twisting and arching until it was blended into a perfect sphere. He lurched. Naruto tensed, watching with wide eyes, waiting for the two to collide at the middle of the clearing, and readied himself to help out his father in that moment that seemed to stretch on endlessly. His limbs jerked, aching to jump and help his father, but restrained himself to meddle. The two fighters finally met, kunai thrusted forward, Sharingan whirled, and Rasengan roared. Then time suddenly righted itself, jerking from the former snail's pace, then speeding up until everything was happening faster than the speed of light. During the time Naruto blinked, the engagement was over. Both Minato and Obito stood frozen some steps away from each other, back to back, hands still extended in their attack's last motion. Naruto let out the breath he was until now holding back, his eyes darting over Obito, who let his arm fall. Naruto's eyes widened and Obito's lips twitched and turned upward in triumph. A thick, greasy and metallic stench hit his nose at the same moment Minato's knees bucked. The Kage swayed, took an unsteady step to right his balance, but failed and collapsed on his knees. Naruto acted without thinking. His muscles twitched, joints bended, tendons strained and he jumped. But failed. Twines shot out from the ground and snapped around his ankle, slamming him hard into the soil, dazing his head, and before he comprehended what happened, they'd wreathed around his body, binding him from head to toe. His head cleared in the next second, his eyes wide in horror, plastered on the scene evolving in front of him. His father was on his knees, Obito slowly circling around him. And closing the distance centimeter by centimeter. The Uchiha stopped, raised an arm and touched Minato's shoulder, the motion unrealistically gentle. "Sensei, you forgot a very important lesson." Obito playfully pushed him and Minato silently tumbled to the side, his body twisting as he rolled down on the small bump of the forest ground. Naruto was finally able to see his face, frozen in his last emotion, features twisted by bewilderment, his eyes wide, but unseeing, foggy. "Never look directly into an Uchiha's eye," Obito exhaled, voice smug and mocking, but Naruto didn't hear it. He was focused on his father's blood-soaked coat, on the blinding crimson against the white fabric which hurt Naruto's eyes but couldn't avert them from it, and the strain became bigger and bigger with every beat of Minato's heart. The grass blades were glinting with the crimson essence as they swayed when Obito stepped next to him, crouched, grabbed a handful of his matted but unstained hair and lifted Minato's head, exposing his neck. The blonde immediately struggled against his bonds, jerking and twitching, his harsh and ragged breathing echoing, but stopped dead again when Obito's voice knifed through the air, voice low and dangerous. "You think that I still care for this word?" "No," Naruto exhaled in a low voice, dipping in despair, but Obito didn't spare him a single glance. A kunai appeared in Obito's hand and shakily settled down on Minato's exposed and weakly pulsing artery. "I'm going to prove." The Uchiha stated, this time his voice a bit unsteady. He wasn't even talking to him, Naruto dimly realized. The muscles twitched in Obito's hands, and the kunai moved and experimentally nibbled the skin, drawing a small droplet of the already waning burgundy essence. The droplet slowly slid down on the blade, stopped on the barrel to unsteadily balance on it, before losing and falling on the ground with an unnaturally loud splash. Obito's lips morphed into a twisted smile, eyes losing the last glint of doubt together with the last shreds of sanity. "I'm going to prove that I don't care anymore." Obito prepared for the final slash, but the motion was left unfinished. Hell broke loose as Naruto ripped free. His mind emptied, snapped, overwhelmed by the devastating rage, and he let everything go, letting it consume him and everything around him. Zetsu's twines melted away in an instant as the blazing chakra exploded from his skin, rampaging like a golden wildfire over the field, scorching the ground and everything in its way, leaving behind nothing more than white-hot coal. He crashed into Obito, sweeping him from his legs and dragging him away from the still motionless Minato. They collided with the hard ground, and Naruto didn't even registering the pain in his ankle as it snapped into a wrong angle, then immediately back. His mind was still numb, chakra flipping around him, growing until it became almost solid. He raised a hand to strike, fingers curling. Around nothing, then in the next moment a small, ink-black dot flickered to life, rapidly growing until it fit into his hand. Zetsu jumped on Naruto, arms folding around his chest to restrain his movements, its unnaturally white skin hissed as they touched the boiling energy. He let down the last of his dam and the word behind him became a blazing inferno. Zetsu immediately let him go while he let out one last cry, but his body was consumed by the overwhelming heat until nothing was left behind than faintly smoking coil. Naruto spared one last glance at the scarred creature and slammed the ebony ball into Obito's chest. It went through him harmlessly and bit into the ground, spitting out chunks of the scarred ground. Obito slipped through him, his motion unsteady, steps wobbly, still dizzy from the previous impact. He stumbled and almost collapsed, but grabbed a hold on himself in the last moment. Naruto didn't hesitate or even pause to think. There was a flicker of gold, the sound of a blast and tearing, and Obito collapsed on the ground, Naruto standing above him, eyes and features emotionless, the last shards of the Bijidama flickering out in his hands. The Uchiha's chest quivered, his lungs whistling. His eyes staring up at him in disbelief, flickering between crimson and black, then settled on the latter, while a hand shakily rose toward Naruto. Naruto's eyes left his face and darted toward the giant hole in his chest, then toward the raised hand, waiting for him to grab it, maybe seeking acceptance or forgiveness, but Naruto didn't move, couldn't make himself to move. This time he couldn't make him forgive. The moment Minato's life was on the line, he'd thrown out his beliefs. For the first time since Pain's invasion, he wanted to hurt, to tear and take his vengeance. It was Obito's fault. Everything was his fault. All the suffering he'd had to go through from the beginning of his childhood until today. He'd killed his parents, his master, his friends. He hunted down the bijou and killed so many innocent people. Arin, Obito finally managed to choke out in a guttural voice. Naruto's eyes flickered back to Obito's face and his lips twisted into a silent snarl, revealing his fangs. His body was still trembling from the adrenaline, his heart loudly pounding against his ribs, but he couldn't find the happiness, nor the bliss of victory he thought would come. There was only cold emptiness. Maybe this was what vengeance felt like, this was the feeling Sasuke had been chasing the whole time. It was disappointing. His heart was so hollow he hardly understood its harsh beating. He should have been happy, satisfied. He had won. But this was a sour victory. Obito let out a low choked sound and desperately tried to draw in breath, but it was in vain. His hand started to tremble, but he kept it up stubbornly until his last drop of energy was about to run out and it faltered. Arin. I'm sorry, he choked out, his fluttering hand clenching and unclenching around nothing in despair, then it twitched and dropped a little. His eyes widened in horror, twisting his features into pure terror. And Naruto could finally see the teenager, lonely and terrified of his fate and dying alone. The blonde was ashamed of himself. Ashamed of his previous feelings, of his desire for revenge, since the broken body in front of him wasn't of a monster's but a dreading teenager's, used and twisted until he'd completely lost himself. Used as a weapon for selfish goals. Obito's arms faltered once more, and this time Naruto reached out and grasped them. They were icy against his own still burning skin. He slowly sank down onto his knees, but received no reaction from the boy at all for a while. Obito's eyes finally flickered up, first in confusion, then as he gradually comprehended the touch, in gratitude. I'm here, Naruto murmured, so low he wasn't sure Obito heard it, but the boy's fingers twitched with his last effort, his lips turning upward, his scars smoothing out on his face, then he went limp. Naruto tightened his hold, but this time he didn't get a reaction. He did it again, but the result was the same. Naruto let out a breath, but it sounded much more a choked sound than an exhale. His shoulders slumped as he slowly pried his fingers open, silently watching as Obito's arm slipped out from it, failing next to his lifeless body. It was over. Naruto couldn't avert his gaze from the slowly cooling body, not until he heard a pained moan. He rushed toward it, falling on his knees beside Minato, eyes darting over his body. His clothes were smoking from his previous chakra burst, the edges burnt by the overwhelming heat, but the real injury was a long gash was across his stomach. It was still losing blood, but thankfully much less than before. What happened? Where's Obito? Minato huffed out between two unsteady breaths, but Naruto didn't answer, nor met his father's eyes. Instead he fished out a small scroll from his pocket and flicker of chakra later a small medikit appeared. Minato's eyes darted to the side toward Zetsu's cold body, then dashed toward the limb body in a black coat a little bit further. He couldn't sense any chakra. You did the right thing. Minato gently exhaled, but it only made Naruto more tensed. His father let out another pained hiss as Naruto helped him to sit, pushed his shirt up, to inspect the injury and patch him up. I wanted to save him, not kill him, Naruto whispered, shame at what he'd done creeping up all over again. He was too strong. You couldn't let him live, Minato pushed. Yeah, he was too strong. He shut his mouth with an audible click and stayed in silence afterward. He worked silently, but efficiently until he was ready. He stayed on his knees, shoulders slumped, and he couldn't get rid of a sinking feeling from his stomach. It was all wrong. Everything was so utterly wrong. It shouldn't be like this. He didn't want vengeance, he should have saved. That damn Uchiha. He knew he'd be able to do it. To talk him out of his obsession. Hey, Minato stated, and Naruto's eyes flickered up to him, you shouldn't look so sober. You managed to travel back in time and save the word. Naruto furrowed his brows, but didn't answer, instead averted his eyes back at his knees. He had just sacrificed one life for the lives of 100,000s. Did he really save the word? Did he change anything? He failed, falling into the circle of hatred. He killed Obito for vengeance. He didn't feel like he had accomplished anything. Everything felt just utterly wrong. Not everyone could have done that, Minato pushed. I mean, I still don't get how you were able to travel back in time in the first place. Naruto narrowed his eyes even more, I already told you, I don't remember. I fought with the real Madara and I shot my last Rasengan at him as a diversion to use the modified Shiki Fuin. Then I was here. Who knows? Maybe the Death God gave me one last chance. Maybe I just messed up the seal. I don't think we'll ever know. Naruto shrugged and let out a tired sigh, his mind wandering back to his last fight with Madara. His mocking expression, his cocky tone, you can't win against me. You are wounded and exhausted, while I'm still untouched. He remembered as his hand shot forward, releasing a kunai, sharpened with wind chakra. The bastard didn't even bother to duck in his arrogance, he simply tilted his head to the side to let the blade pass. The chakra which covered his blade stretched out, drawing a thin red line on the Uchiha's arrogant face. His smile grew into a grin when the first droplet of crimson liquid flowed down his chin and dropped to the ground with an unnaturally loud splash. Naruto shook his head to get rid of the memory, and his gaze traveled up toward the now almost brown blood stain on Minato's coat. His right hand moved toward his cheek unconsciously at the exact same place he remembered the cut on the smug Uchiha's face. He hadn't even bothered to dodge. A sour half-grimace spread across his face, when the memory popped up in his mind, the thin red line, the unnatural loudness when the small drops of crimson liquid dropped to the ground. Even Kurama didn't know it how we got here. And he finally realized something else. The emptiness wasn't only in his heart, but in his mind. There were no muttering, no encouragement or comforting words. Kurama hadn't talked to him since they get their feet into the mountain's graveyard. Kurama? He hesitantly exhaled, waiting for an answer, but none came. He shot up at his foot, not sparing a glance at his confused father. Kurama, he repeated, this time with a hint of panic when he still didn't get a reply. I'm here. Kurama finally replied, his voice weak and bewildered, but it was enough to calm Naruto down. But Naruto. There was blood. The fox's voice was ashamed, low, almost not enough to call it a whisper, but it still echoed in his head. Naruto froze, turning the words over and over. What? He exhaled, Edo Tensei, don't bleed. His mind suddenly started to spin, and he made a hesitant wobbling step backward, before simply collapsed back on his knees. Naruto's eyes widened, his heart pumped against his ribs with insane speed while his breathing increased, however no oxygen reached his screaming body. His mind locked out Minato's concerned yells. Only one word was repeated inside his head, closing out every other thought, everything from his surroundings. Only one word echoed back and forth in his mind continuously. Blood. He heard his voice distantly, however he didn't feel that he had opened his mouth to whisper, "Dead people don't bleed." What? Minato blurted, eyes wide, face confused, and Naruto finally snapped back and spared a glance at him. He bled. Madara had bled, he stated, like it would explain everything. Madara, he was alive and not a corpse. And that means he was able to seal the Jubi but, this isn't. This isn't what I wanted, Naruto dully mumbled. If this is the infinite Tsukuyomi, then it should have ended differently, but this is wrong, this isn't what I wanted, he repeated, grabbing his hair with a hand. I didn't wanted revenge. I wanted to save him. This isn't right. What are you talking about, Naruto? What does this mean? Minato asked as he dragged himself closer to his son, who finally glanced down at him. Naruto observed his father for a long, silent moment, rolling over every single moment since he arrived here in his head. He let out a choked sound, something between a sob and a hysterical laughter. It means that this word isn't real, and you're also not real. The word around Naruto suddenly shifted and slipped to the side. Minato's concerned eyes shimmered, then melted into an abstract ice-blue whirl. The green woods behind them mixed together with the soil and with the blue sky, everything slowly swallowed by a spiraling vortex until nothing else could be seen beside a pair of whirling Sharingan, glowing with the sinister color of blood. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.